Welcome to Raving Ryan. I'm your host, Ryan Anastasio. Today I have a very special guest, State Representative from the 147th House District and Democratic nominee for Attorney General William Tong. Representative, how are you? Thanks for coming on.
How are you, Ryan?
Yeah, so you grew up in Connecticut and you're the son of Chinese immigrants. And then you went on to, you grew up in West Hartford, and then you went on to an Ivy League education at Brown University, and then at the University of Chicago. Can you tell us a little bit about your early life and some of the challenges you faced in your early life?
Sure. My parents were immigrants. I grew up really working side by side with my parents in a Chinese restaurant. We lived in West Hartford at first, and then we moved to Glastonbury, and I went to grade school around there and spent, most nights and weekends when I was a little bit younger than you, actually, like your brother Sam's age. When I was 9 or 10, I started working in the restaurant. So if you challenged me and we had to do it right now, I could probably cook everything on a standard Chinese restaurant menu. But it was hard. It was hard. Child labor laws be damned. It was hard growing up in an immigrant family and working nights and weekends with my parents, but I also learned a ton growing up there. So I was very fortunate. I had a very happy childhood, and it was a really great experience.
Yeah, then you went on to Brown University and then the University of Chicago Law School. And I understand you had former President Barack Obama as a teacher there. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. You catch people at different points in their life. And, of course, we know him as our president, as 44, right? And as this larger-than-life figure. But when I met him, he was in the middle of losing badly a congressional primary on the south side of Chicago to Bobby Rush, an incumbent Democratic congressman. And I believe the president lost that race by 30 points. He was a state senator. And I think as not Dreams of My Father, but the next book, he talks about how much of a strain that put on his marriage with Michelle. And that was a really rocky period. And so the Senate race, Barack Obama makes this promise to Michelle that that's going to be his last race. Yeah. And that didn't start out very well either. He was not the front runner. And then both frontrunners on the Democratic and Republican sides fell apart. And then he gave, one of the best speeches ever, a historic speech in Boston at the Democratic Convention. I was in the hall for that. Mm-hmm. And then the rest is history. He was pretty cool, I think he would admit that he has a reputation for being cool. And he is in person, but also extraordinarily smart. The section of constitutional law that he taught to me focused on equal protection and the Due Process Clause in the 14th Amendment. So, that's how I knew him. I wish I was a better student, and I wish I'd showed up to class on time. But, I had a girlfriend and loved hanging out in Chicago, so I had other priorities.
Yeah. And you're currently a lawyer at Finn Dixon Hurling LLP, where you have practiced for 14 years now. And you currently also serve as a state legislature, where you serve as the House Chair of the Judiciary Committee. Can you tell us more about your experience in law, and why do you think you're qualified for this job as the State Attorney General?
Sure. So after the University of Chicago Law School, from the very first day of being a lawyer, I've been a civil litigator in continuous practice for 18 years now. Actually, I did 3 years at one of the biggest firms in the world, Simpson Thacher and Bartlett, in New York City. And there I worked on 2 huge cases, 2 of the biggest fraud cases in history. They're cases that extended across. The first case was a international case, so it was both in New York and in Japan. And the second case was in many states across the country. So those are the sorts of cases that the Attorney General does, big civil cases, the case against Volkswagen, the opioid investigation, the case against the national mortgage servicers, and now the case against the generic drug manufacturers. These are all cases that George Jepsen has led as our Attorney General. And they're big civil litigation cases that happen in multiple jurisdictions across the country, state and federal court. So this is the sort of work that I've done, and now I've done that kind of work mostly in Connecticut state and federal court. at Finn-Dixon and Hurling for 15 years, so a total of 18. And I think that really is what separates me from my primary opponents and also from my general election opponent, Sue Hatfield. She's a prosecutor and, does day-to-day criminal work here in Connecticut. That's just not what the Attorney General
doesn't do criminal work. Yeah.
the criminal work, right? And the Attorney General only does civil cases and then, of course, the nuts and bolts of state government.
And something that Sue Hatfield and your opponents in the primary brought up was they said that you don't have enough trial experience and you haven't been in the courtroom too much. Is that true? And
No, it's just not true. And, I've tried cases in state court and federal court. But let's be clear, that's not the standard, and that's not what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court said very clearly that you
10
have
years,
10 years of active practice at the bar of the state, and that you have to have litigation experience that you do for clients and that you do as your primary means of making a living. And the fact is I have tons and tons of litigation experience, 18 years of it at 2 extraordinarily prestigious firms. Now, the fact is I'm not a prosecutor, right? So I'm not in court every day doing DUIs and arraignments and putting people in jail for drug offenses, right? I do big civil litigation, business cases, right? And sort of the type of work your dad does as an accountant for his bigger business clients. And like that work, those matters take a lot of time. They're heavily litigated against big expensive lawyers and big expensive firms and big companies. They take years and years and years, and they rarely go to trial to verdict. They most often settle, and then when they settle for tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, which then hopefully gets deposited into the general fund to help our state pay for education and roads. So take big tobacco, for example. Those cases, weren't really tried to verdict. Those cases resulted in huge settlements and happened in state and federal courts across the country, and that's the kind of work that I do. So there's really just no question about it. Sue appears to have developed a birther-like obsession with my qualifications. It comes as no surprise to me because she's a Trump delegate and an ardent Trump supporter, and she's really different than the other candidates, I think, running for statewide office on the Republican side. You don't hear a ton about Donald Trump from some of the other candidates because, he's not particularly popular here in Connecticut, but she's really hitched her wagon to Donald Trump.
Yeah, and you just brought up Donald Trump. In your campaign, you've really focused on this issue against protecting citizens of the state of Connecticut against the Trump administration. And someone like Sue Hatfield who is a Trump supporter and was a Trump delegate. She's saying that we need to focus on some more state issues. And she says that you're just focusing on trying to nationalize this race. Why are you trying? Do you think you should focus more on state issues than the national Trump administration?
These are state issues. So I'll give you an example. The Affordable Care Act is a state issue. There are thousands of people across Connecticut who have pre-existing conditions that are being covered by the Affordable Care Act. There are thousands of people who are not declaring bankruptcy like they would have 10 years ago because of their medical expenses. We've cut personal bankruptcies in this country in half because now you don't have as many people declaring personal bankruptcy because of medical circumstances. So you've got people who have access to relatively affordable health care that they didn't have before, and they're getting coverage for pre-existing conditions, and young people are getting coverage, and the president's trying to undo all of that. And right now there are 19 Republican attorneys general in Texas, in federal court over the last couple of days, trying to invalidate the Affordable Care Act and coverage for pre-existing conditions. So this is a core issue to Connecticut families. And so the question for Sue Hatfield is, she wants to talk about all these different tests. Let's talk about the real test. It's the Trump test. It's a very simple test. Yeah. When the president,
the rally last week,
when the president is coming after us, are you going to stand with Trump or are you going to stand with Connecticut? So is she going to join 19 Republican attorneys general when she's a Republican attorney general, right, and try to invalidate the Affordable Care Act and try to get a judge to rule it as unconstitutional, or is she going to stand with families in Connecticut that depend on it? It's a Connecticut issue. The state and local tax deduction issue. right? The Trump tax law that directly targets states like Connecticut. That he's put a target on every taxpayer, on the back of every taxpayer here in Connecticut. And the question is, are you going to stand with Connecticut or are you going to stand with Donald Trump? I stand with Connecticut every single time.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying in the context of your job, where you would be dealing with those issues. But last week at the rally, you said again you should take the Trump test. But you were talking to many candidates for governor and the state legislature. How does their role have to? The focus on mostly state issues, the state budget. Why do you think those candidates should have to take the Trump test on the Republican side?
You know, I think everybody should, because it touches every aspect of state government, every aspect of our lives. So let's talk about the environment, for example. The president seeking to roll back protections for us by eliminating emission standards in upwind states that's polluting our air. That's something the governor will have to deal with, right? The governor's going to have to find a way to strengthen our state's environmental laws so that our air remains clean. There's the tax law that directly impacts the governor and the state treasurer. Talk about our gun laws, okay? If Sue Hatfield wants to talk about state issues, let's talk about Connecticut's strongest in the nation. Some people say the second strongest in the nation. I think strongest in the nation, gun laws. As you know, Ryan, I'm one of the architects of those gun laws. I wrote the bump stocks, but I wrote the domestic violence gun law in 2015. And I'm also part of the team that wrote the post-Sandy Hook reforms. And before that, I wrote the lost and stolen firearms law. I also wrote the bill to ban ghost guns, which included...
Did not pass yet.
No, it didn't pass. It passed committee, but it didn't pass the House or the Senate. I wrote that bill. It included a provision that bans 3D printed guns. We could have gone further, but there's language in there that addresses 3D printed guns. Sue Hatfield opposed any more gun laws. She opposed the ban on ghost guns. The CCDL endorsed her.
Then they unendorsed her.
Then they unendorsed her because there was a national uproar about 3D printed guns, and she tried to walk it back.
I believe she said that she wouldn't support 3D printed guns. That's why they unendorsed her.
Yeah, but that was after she opposed my bill in the first place, banning ghost guns, which included 3D printed guns. So either she didn't read the bill, and she didn't know what she was talking about, or we tried to pass a bill banning ghost guns, and the NRA was able to effectively kill that bill in the legislature. And then you've got a national uproar about 3D printed guns, and all of a sudden Sue Hatfield, who was endorsed by the CCDL, is now walking it back, and they unendorsed her on the eve of the general election. I mean, you're pretty savvy, Ryan. What does that tell you? It tells you she was preparing for a general election where she's trying to seem not as extreme and more moderate. And I don't think people are going to buy it. She's a strong NRA candidate, and she ought to just, embrace that and not try to walk it back.
And if you're elected as Attorney General, you're not going to be in the state legislature anymore, but will you try to work with the state legislatures to try to get the ghost gun bill passed?
Sure.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about guns, we've talked about a lot about the Trump administration, but the job of the Attorney General is very broad. You're going to be doing many different things because you are the chief civil litigator for the state. So what are going to be some of your other top priorities if you're elected?
So I think we really need to strengthen our consumer protection efforts here in Connecticut. There are three areas that I think are really important that we get focused on right away. One is the way that technology companies take advantage of consumers here in Connecticut and across the country. I think so many of us, and you'll get there.
John places a Facebook and Google.
Not just Facebook and Google, but you have a phone?
Yep.
What phone do you have?
iPhone.
Which iPhone?
6S.
Okay, 6S, right? So 6S, you're a little behind now.
Yeah, it's filming you right now.
What's that? It's filming me right now. Okay, so the 6S or the 5 are relatively high-tech, up-to-date machines, but we heard that Apple may be slowing down those phones to make you buy an iPhone X. Does that sound fair to you?
No.
Okay, so when you're someone like me or your dad who's got kids to raise, there's just, in the modern world, there's a tremendous amount of financial pressure. It's a squeeze, and parents like us are constantly feeling like we're under siege. We got to pay for our kids' phones, and we got to pay for our cars, and We've got to pay for internet access and daycare and healthcare coverage. And there's so many things that really contribute to this squeeze and this pressure. And so I think it's the Attorney General's job to push back on that, to try to create room for people so they can breathe and they can run a business and raise their families.
Yeah, and another big issue here in Connecticut is casinos. Obviously, you've seen the new MGM casino that's open in Springfield. Looks very nice, and it could possibly make people from the Connecticut going up to Springfield instead of going to Foxwoods or Mohegan Sun. Attorney General Jepsen was working on the compact with the tribes to try to create a casino in Bridgeport. Are you going to be working with the tribes and the MGM to try to create another casino?
And I really believe that as Attorney General, it will be my job to bring everyone together and have a conversation about how best not just protect the industry, but to strengthen it. And I'm really concerned about Springfield, and I'm really concerned about Bridgeport.
Yeah.
And I'm really concerned about New Haven, and I'm concerned about job creation in those cities and the surrounding communities, and want to make sure that we have a really robust conversation about whether and how a casino might be part of the solution. And so this is a larger conversation, and it's really important that as the Democratic nominee for Attorney General, and I believe as the next Attorney General here in Connecticut, that I not say anything to prejudice, what happens in the future. But let me just say that I think that job creation is extraordinarily important, and I think that doing all that we can to protect these industries is extraordinarily important.
Yeah, Connecticut hasn't had a Republican Attorney General since the 1950s. It's been a long time. But we have a tendency to elect Republican governors, and Richard Blumenthal worked with Republican governors for most of his tenure. If you were elected in a Republican, Bob Stefanowski wins, will you be able to work with him on some issues?
Sure. I mean, just look at what I've done. Yeah. So the Second Chance Society law was dead until I cut the deal with Themis and Len Fasano. Yeah. The budget in 2017 was nowhere after session was over. And when the four caucuses, House and Senate, Democrat and Republican, four caucuses, and the governor stopped talking to each other, it was a small group of Democrats and Republicans who sat down privately and started to have a conversation and brokered what was the beginnings of the deal for the bipartisan budget. I led the Democrats in the House in those conversations with Sean Scanlon and Michelle Cook and Chris Soto for Democrats. I think it was Pam Stanesky and Vin Candelora and Tom O'Day for the Republicans. And we had conversations, and basically they agreed to abandon, for now, their attack on collective bargaining, and we would move away from this proposal the governor put forward to shift teacher pensions to municipalities. That was the basis for the budget deal. And I think if you ask people in the General Assembly who can they do business with, Democrat or Republican, I'd be one of the people on that list. And that's why I'm able to broker these agreements and these compromises. It's really important, and I'll do that as Attorney General.
I want to finish up with some personal questions. Sure. Do you have any hobbies?
I do. I like to fish.
Yeah. I know I asked you this before, but I wanted to ask you on camera. Do you have any favorite sports teams?
I do. I'm a pro football fan, but you're going to get me in trouble if I tell you what team I like.
That's okay. You can do it. Giants, Patriots?
So we talked at the beginning about how my parents are immigrants. Yeah. And my grandfather came to this country in 1963. And he started in Kansas and then Alabama and then wound his way to Connecticut. So when he came to this country, the Dallas Cowboys were America's team. Yeah. And he adopted them, and he learned American football. And then when my father immigrated to this country, he learned from his father-in-law to be a Dallas Cowboys fan, and I must say that it stuck.
Are you a big UConn fan?
I am. And actually, my dad he moved on from being a Dallas Cowboys fan, so he cured himself of that affliction. I'm not quite there yet. But he's a huge UConn women's fan, basketball fan. And I like them both, the men and the women. Yeah,
well, look, the men could have hope this year. They do have a new coach, Dan Hurley.
Yeah.
And I'm going to finish up with a very hard last question. Connecticut's really well known for its pizza places. Do you have a favorite in the state?
Oh, that's hard. I guess I'll go with, Stanford Pizza is wonderful.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of options at home in Stamford.
Can you name one?
Yeah, Colony.
Yeah. Okay.
Colony's the big one.
Yep.
I like Remo's too, which is wonderful. And there's a lot of options in Stamford. I know it's all about New Haven pizza.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite in New Haven?
I don't really have a favorite.
Yeah.
I love them all. I love, but I also love Roseland in Derby.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Have you been there?
Yeah, I've been there.
It's really good, right?
Yeah, really good.
It's really good.
Yeah.
So I like to eat. I don't know if you follow me on Facebook, but we have this thing called Tong Tastings.
Yeah.
So we've been to a number of these places, and we've talked about how wonderful they are. Everything from Pepe's to Modern, Delegna, and all these great places in New Haven, and then the places in Stamford too.
Yeah, I want to thank you very much for
Let me say, actually, you know what? My personal favorite is Sorrento's on High Ridge Road in Stamford. That's my hometown pizza place, run by Tony Uva and his family. So I'm just going to say Sorrento's in Stamford.
Okay. Yeah, I want to thank you very much for coming on. It was great to have you here. If you want to, you can go follow him on, if you want to see the Tong Tastings, you can go to follow him on Facebook and on Twitter. And make sure to go give me a follow on Facebook and Twitter. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to check out my website, ravingryan.com. Thank you for watching. Reporting for Raving Ryan, I'm Ryan Anastasio.